Chapter 11, Section 1, Segregation. Mendel wanted the answers to another question. Had the recessive alleles disappeared, or were they still present in the F1 plants? To answer this question, he allowed all 7 kinds of F1 hybrid plants to produce an F2 generation by self-pollination. In effect, he crossed the F1 generation with itself to produce the F2 offspring as shown in Figure 11-4. The F1 cross. The results of the F1 cross were remarkable. When Mendel compared the F2 plants, he discovered that the traits controlled by the recessive alleles had reappeared. Roughly 1/4 of the F2 plants showed the trait controlled by the recessive allele. Why did the recessive alleles seem to disappear in the F1 generation and then reappear in the F2 generation? To answer this question, let's take a closer look at one of Mendel's crosses. Explaining the F1 cross. To begin, Mendel assumed that a dominant allele had masked the correspondent recessive allele in the F1 generation. However, that trait controlled by the recessive allele showed up in some of the F2 plants. This reappearance indicated that at some point the alleles for shortness had been separated from the alleles for tallness. How did this separation or segregation of alleles occur? Mendel suggested that the alleles for tallness and shortness in the F1 plants segregated from each other during the formation of sex cells or gametes. Did that suggestion make sense? Let's assume, as perhaps Mendel did, that the F1 plants inherited an allele for tallness from the tall parent and an allele for shortness from the short parent. Because the allele for the tallness is dominant, all the F1 plants are tall. When each F1 plant flowers and produces gametes, the 2 alleles segregate from each other so that each gamete carries only a single copy of a gene. Therefore, each F1 plant produces 2 types of gametes, those with the allele for tallness and those with the allele for shortness. Look at Figure 11-5 to see how alleles separate during gamete formation and then pair up again in the F2 generation. A capital letter T represents a dominant allele. A lowercase letter T represents a recessive allele. The result of this process is an F2 generation with new combinations of alleles.